Okay. Welcome everyone to the launch of our Varieties of Indoctrination data. We're very pleased to introduce our new data set on the politicization of education and the media. This is a project that has generously been funded by the ERC and is in collaboration with the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg. I'm greeting you today from Glasgow. My name is Anja Neundorf and I'm the project lead of this project. This is something that goes back a few years. We've probably been working on this for a good 6-7 years from starting to talking about this, that we don't really have good measures of indoctrination and how education works, in particular in the media, in affecting people. And so it is a real pleasure to introduce this data today, to make it publicly available for everyone to work with. We hope that you find it useful for your own research, for your teaching, or for your work outside academia, of course, as well. So just to give you a quick overview to decide whether you want to stay here and learn more about our data. We cover about 160 countries and have annual data starting in 1945 up to today. And we have 27 original data indicators. Most of them are in the field of education, and then we have also complemented the more wider media data with new indicators as well. We cover a variety of topics in our data regarding schools, the media, and also topics such as patriotism and so on. And then based on these indicators, we have coded or created 11 new abstract indices that measure the different aspects and dimensions of indoctrination. So before I kind of get started, I want to do a big shout out to the many people across multiple disciplines that have helped to create this data. First of all, there's the core team that you see up there. Without them, it really wouldn't have been possible. And we have spent so many hours on Zoom over the past few years to make this happen. But there's a wider group of people who have very much influenced how the data looks like today, and therefore they are rightfully acknowledged as co-authors of the data and the codebook as well. But all of this wouldn't have been possible with the invaluable feedback of some key important scholars who have worked in this field and who have helped us to sharpen our ideas and the codebook and so on. Then at V-Dem, we had incredible support by specific people that helped us to collect the data. And then with these kind of massive projects, it really wouldn't be possible with some really talented RAs that have helped us to recruit the experts, but also, for example, Christina, who's also joined here today, has helped us to create the Shiny app to make the data even more accessible. And then lastly, all of this wouldn't be possible without 760 country experts that have, in a way, created the data, really. So this is a massive community effort, and therefore we really hope that, in a way, everyone putting so much work into it, that now we can use it and bring the field of indoctrination and for education and media forward with having more comparative data. Okay, so big thank you to everyone. Hold on, why is this so much? So what will I cover today, or what we will cover here in this launch event? I will very briefly talk about our concept of indoctrination before then going into detail about how we collected the data. I will show you a few descriptive findings and talk also a bit about, can we trust our data? And then we talk about more practical issues such as how can we access the data, to download it, and then we will give you a short demonstration of our Shiny app. We will also have some time at the end for questions. For kind of easier way of facilitating this, I would ask you to use the Q&A function on Zoom to post any questions you have. We have here some team members who will help answering the kind of smaller, more clarification questions on the go, and then we will keep the bigger questions for the end to give a bit more elaborative answers. So please do use the Q&A functions, and we will keep an eye on this and answer them on the way. Okay. Okay, so let's get started. When this is a project that focuses on indoctrination. I guess many of you, when they hear the word indoctrination, think of the Nazis or the pioneers and the communist countries and so on. And that's certainly true, that is indoctrination, of kind of trying to rally people around a certain cause. But our concept of indoctrination is a bit wider. We think of indoctrination as something that is regime-led to socialize citizens into the ideas, the norms, identities of a specific political system, and something like the Pledge of Allegiance that American school children celebrate every morning is also part of this, of building a kind of alliance to the country, patriotism, and so on. So this is our starting point, and is important for kind of how we thought about the data collection and how we build this. So indoctrination really is something that is regime-led and is to create citizens that voluntarily comply with the regime to help stabilize political regimes. And therefore, we think of this as something that both types of regime, whether democratic or autocratic, need for their survival. When we think about kind of how can this be achieved, we focus in particular on education and the media. There are other tools out there like the military or mass organizations like the pioneers that I mentioned. We focus on education and the media as particularly important. Education is something that in most countries today is compulsory. So that means that most countries can reach the whole population when they're most malleable, when they're young. The media, on the other hand, is something that we're also all exposed to, and that can kind of help to reinforce the narrative or the message of the regime. So this is why we're focusing on these two tools in particular. And then when we think about kind of how indoctrination works, we distinguish two dimensions. The first is the potential to indoctrinate. So the regimes or states need the means to indoctrinate, and then of course the question of what is indoctrinated, so the content in particular. Here you see a map of the concepts that we developed in our work and how we thought about indoctrination. So the round bubbles in a way are kind of our concepts, which we then also measured as indices, while the squares here are the list of indicators that go into each of these indices. I will not go into too much detail about how we develop this and how we think about this on a more conceptual level. You can read the accompanying paper that we have also just published as a V-Dem working paper if you really want to know more about this. But the way this kind of works is that we think of indoctrination as something quite abstract that you cannot directly observe, but you can observe some of its implications, such as if we think about control over agent to be an important part of building the potential to indoctrinate, then we can maybe measure things like the autonomy of teachers in the classroom, or whether the hiring or firing of teacher is political, right? So this is something that is more observable than, in general, like how much control over, teachers is there that kind of keeps this important agent of socialization online to really transmit what the regime wants to transmit. On the other hand, we have things like, the content focusing on, key democratic characteristics that can be integrated in the curriculum, such as political rights, whether democracy is promoted, elections and so on, or pluralism, critical thinking, all key aspects of what makes democracy. And all of these, can then be aggregated to an indices or something more abstract. Yeah. Similar map, or maybe just to kind of mention is, obviously, if you don't believe in indoctrination, or you're not interested in this, you can just use any of our items on their own as indicators, or you can kind of work with these indices. Yeah. So we have a similar map from concept to indicators for the media. As you see, we have fewer items here, and in order to create the indices, we added some more existing data measured mainly by V-Dem, as they use a very similar approach to us. But this is kind of the basic outline of our ideas and how we then developed indicators that we then try to measure. So let's talk about how do we collect data like this? How can we make this observable now? The challenges for this kind of data collection is that, as I already pointed out, something like indoctrination is a quite abstract latent concept, and we cannot directly observe it. We can only observe its consequences. So, where can we find information to do this? One might say, well, just rely on archival primary sources, official documents, these kind of things. But that's not really feasible if you want to measure multiple latent concepts for which you need multiple indicators to kind of be able to abstract to these concepts. So we do need a lot of indicators and data, but trying to do that then on a kind of global sample of countries going back in time is extremely resource intensive. The other problem is that, especially what we're studying here, something like indoctrination, it's not so easy to study from official documents that measure de jure policies, right? And especially education is a huge tension when it comes to de jure versus de facto, what's happening in the classroom or what's happening on the ground. While, for example, there might be no law that forbids teachers, to kind of be recruited based on their moral character or political ideology, but that is what's happening in practice, right? How do we tease that out? That's very difficult with official documents. And this is why we decided to conduct an expert survey to get around these issues that I just outlined. And in order to do this, it was very important to get really high quality data and follow the highest standards in how to conduct an expert survey. And to achieve this, we teamed up with the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg that has, over the past 10-15 years, become probably the leading institute when it comes to expert survey. And we were able to use their infrastructure, including their computational capacity to also then deal with our data and create the estimates that I will talk a bit more about in a second. So working with V-Dem has then allowed us to run this expert survey and collect the data. So we implemented, it looks like a survey with 27 questions. I will show you an example in a second. And data was collected between January and May last year. The advantage of an expert survey like this is that these kind of measures allow us to get both accurate and also this comprehensive coverage and to measure all the different indicators we need, as it is much more feasible than using archival data. And what we're drawing on here basically is the country experts that have an in-depth knowledge of the education system and the topics we're studying, and they kind of make evaluative judgments that go beyond maybe what is in the law, but more kind of what is actually happening on the ground. We have Kyle here today, who was one of the pioneers of also developing all of this. So any questions regarding the measurement model and the data collection, we can ask Kyle as well later on. Okay, so here is an example of how this looked like, what the experts had to do. Here's an example of our centralization question, and it's a simple question, like, to what extent does the national authority set the official curriculum in schools? There's often a little explanation to clarify key terms in our question, and then experts had usually kind of four options, like an ordinal scale, where they had to choose an option for every year of the country that they're coding. Yeah, and then what is also important is you see here, we asked them for every year, in addition, how confident are you in your answer? Which is something very important, right? We want to allow that sometimes people, they might know, very well what happened in the last 20 years, but they're not so sure maybe what happened in the 60s. And it's okay, we can take that into account in our model. So this looks quite demanding, right? 27 questions, a variety of topics that are covered in our expert survey here. We need good experts to do this. So that is the core. That's the main challenge, to find the right people for every country or for most countries in the world to be able to answer these questions. So what we did is we worked with a group of fantastic RAs to comb through all kind of websites and publication conferences, NGOs, and so on to find our country experts. We then contacted 24,000 education experts from around the world, with more than 1,400 responding to our call and completing a kind of online expression of interest form. We had 2 RAs that were based in education that helped us then to vet these experts. So we wanted to make sure that they are experts and that they will be able to answer our questions. So we looked at, kind of what are their qualifications and so on. These experts are academics. Usually they have to be independent from the state and so on. Yeah, so all of this needed to be checked. So we end up with 760 education experts from 160 countries who completed our survey and who also were compensated for their work. This is very time consuming, and I do hope that some of the experts might join us today, because we did invite them to come. So hopefully now you see the fruits of your labor. So thank you very much again for this. Here's the coverage in terms of the globe and how many coders we have in each of the countries. Gray countries is where unfortunately we couldn't recruit coders, so that you see that coverage in Africa is a bit more patchy. And then we're missing countries that are really small, that have less than 1 million inhabitants, but these are countries that we didn't really kind of focus on in the expert recruitment. So no wonder that they're missing. And then there's a variation. So in Africa, for example, we unfortunately have quite a few countries that have only 1 to 3 coders. And then there's some countries that have quite a lot of coders, which is what we ultimately wanted. And I will explain in a second why we need that, why we need multiple coders for every country and every variable every year. So maybe many of you are not familiar with expert surveys or don't really trust them. And yeah, sure, there are problems here. There's potential issues with these kind of expert surveys that especially when we talk about evaluative judgment, right? It's sometimes difficult. Where's the evidence? Where do people have this kind of knowledge from? So there might be just coder divergence. How strong is the political character of teacher hiring and firing? That's something difficult to observe also for experts. So they kind of have to trust a bit the knowledge that they have, and there might be natural divergence, right? So we need multiple coders to kind of come to a convergence towards what might be the true value. Yeah. There's also, of course, reliability issues. Sometimes coders might make mistakes. Yeah, so they want to click one value, but they accidentally click another value, or they don't get the year quite right when there was a reform that they wanted to pick up, and so on. I already mentioned confidence in responses, right? So some coders feel more confident in their responses and some less. So all of this, kind of should be taken into account and maybe should be weighted more, right? If a coder says, no, I'm pretty certain that is the correct answer, maybe that answer should be weighted more than somebody saying, oh, I'm really guessing here, yeah? And then there's a fourth issue, which is that coders might have different interpretation of the responses, which leads to them giving responses that are maybe more lenient, and some are, much more strict in interpreting this ordinal scale. So these are the kind of things we need to take into account when we then get to our country year estimate for each indicator, right? The last point is something really interesting that Kyle and his colleagues have worked on and have come up with a really brilliant solution, which is using vignettes. Vignettes are just hypothetical examples that lie in between categories on our ordinal questions. Yeah, so here you see, for example, the vignette for our centralization question, where this kind of hypothetical example is kind of between the different categories, and we ask our coders, okay, like given this kind of coding scheme, where would you code this particular country that is hypothetical? And that helps us to kind of identify the coders that are a bit more lenient and those that are a bit stricter in how they code. All of this information, so the multiple coders, the uncertainty about the measures, the potential errors that happen, plus the vignettes, all of this then feeds into the so-called Bayesian IRT measurement model that V-Dem, in particular Kyle and colleagues, have developed in how to then aggregate. So if you look into our data set on the coder level, we have about 60,000 observations, okay? So we want not, kind of 5, 10, responses for each coder for every country, right? We want one country estimate. So taking all of this information together, we then get a so-called probability distribution for every indicator. And what we then do is we take the median on these probability distributions to give you our country year estimate. Yeah. So in our data, you get a country year estimate that is basically the median, taking all of this information into account. Yeah. These point estimates have a range that is, not really meaningful. It often ranges from kind of -4 to +4. And these are the variables that you probably should be using when you do any kind of quantitative analysis. We do also provide you with some rescaled indicators that you find as 2 versions that kind of scale it back onto the original 0 to 3 scale, for example. So that is also very helpful for more kind of, let's say, descriptive analysis. Musek will demonstrate this when he's demonstrating the Shiny app. But the advantage of this approach is that we don't just have now the one estimate, but we get some uncertainty around this, right? Which is, probably true, right? They are maybe not the truth. It's still evaluative. It's an expert opinion ultimately. But this approach at least allows us to get confidence intervals around this. So this is kind of how we created. So every indicator, which is based on these expert answers to these, questions, is measured this way. We then use these indicators to create latent indices to measure our indoctrination. Yeah, and these range from 0 to 1 and are just simply kind of Bayesian factor analysis or averages if there's just 2 indicators that go into these indices and so on. Yeah, happy to talk more about this because that is of course the heart of how we created it. But let me now kind of show you some of our results and kind of what is the state of indoctrination around the world. So looking at one of our key dimensions, which is the potential to indoctrinate. So this is an index that, kind of adds up all of these items like, control over teachers, centralization of the curriculum, is there kind of, politics taught in schools and so on, right? And so, summing this all up to one index, this is how the world looks like. So high values here mean this country in 21 had high potential or the means to indoctrinate, while 0 means it doesn't. If you look at this, some obvious cases maybe stick out. The top countries in terms of indoctrination potential is North Korea, China, and also the United Emirates. While the bottom countries are the US, Finland, and Portugal. Yeah, so there's a bit of a pattern here. Democracies might have a weaker potential to indoctrinate, while autocracies seem to have a higher potential. The other second kind of core index we are interested in our research and in this data is, what is indoctrinated? And here we created one index that ranges from the most authoritarian, so these have low values, to the most potential democratic way of promoting politics in school. And again, you see a pattern that kind of makes sense. So we see the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden here at the top of being the most, democratic in terms of school content in what they promote in their curriculum, while at the bottom we have North Korea, Iran, and Myanmar that are the most authoritarian. If you don't want to look at these indices as kind of, these latent top indices, you can, of course, again, just look at the specific indicators you might be interested in. Here is a way of looking at our indicators that go into the indoctrination content over time for autocracies and democracies. There's quite a bit of movement. You also see that, especially when it comes to the promotion of political rights and duties, we're not, certain that, democracies and autocracies are so different from one another as we see the confidence intervals overlapping here. Yeah. So this is just a bit of a demonstration in how you might want to use the data and what is in the data. All of this depends, of course, do we trust this? Yeah, that is something that, of course, you as a community, as hopefully you start using the data, also have to explore. And I'm sure there will be some who will not, kind of trust this kind of data, and that is absolutely fine. But we tried, of course, as well to see, can we trust our own data, or maybe ultimately, and given the topics we study here, maybe the country experts simply defer from a country being, a democracy or an autocracy of what they might be doing in terms of indoctrination efforts. Of course, we try to avoid this by asking, is this country, indoctrinating, or is it by looking at much more specific aspects of what we think feeds into indoctrination. So trying to avoid that already. We see some validity in our data already through the pattern I just showed you, so that the countries, that should have more democratic indoctrination content do score higher as well, and so on. So there's some face validity, but we also try to kind of look at some construction validity here by trying to match our indicators to existing data that is related. And now we did find about, we have validation data in this way, matching variables for about 22 of our 27 indicators. Of course, they're not always exactly the same. They have sometimes, very different sources. So there's some really brilliant data that is based on textbooks that is relevant, for example, studying, finding comparable data to patriotism or something like this. Sometimes data will have very different coverage, so it might just cross-sectional or just a few countries or something like this. But whatever we found that looks at maybe data that has been collected in very different ways often, does it correlate with our indicators? And if so, then we can probably be more confident that our data does measure something more than simply people making a kind of inference from a country being democratic or autocratic and what should be happening. And we do see that across all the different validation exercises we did, that the correlation or the correct classification for categorical variable is about 0.6, which is quite high, given that these variables are not exactly the same and often are based on very different sources. We have more on this in the paper, so do look at this, and we're happy to pick this up in the discussion if you like. Okay, so now kind of, maybe by now you kind of got to know a bit what our data is, how we collected it, how does it look like, can we trust it? If you now decided like, yeah, that looks quite interesting, I would like to have a play around, or this is great, I really need this, one variable for my paper. The data is now accessible on our website, so you can just go and download it. When you go to our website, you have, first of all, also our working paper that goes into more detail about these things that I just talked about. You also have the codebook here if you want to look at each variable and also just what we have in there. And then you have here two tabs, one for downloading the data and one that takes you to our Shiny app, which we will also demonstrate in a second. When you go to download the data, we ask you a few questions that help us to keep track of how many people use our data, where do people come from, and so on. And some aggregate figures of this we will probably also use to report back to the funder to, kind of hopefully say it was not just all wasted money, but people do use the data. Let's hope so. So this is just a few questions. Once you complete that form, you'll be taken to a download page where you can then choose what data set you want. You have different options here, which version you would like, and which format you want to work with, depending on the software you use. So you can just kind of click through and then it will automatically download. So let me just quickly show you what you have here. Most of you would probably be interested in the country year data set, which just simply aggregates our indicators and indices for the country year. You have two versions, the base version, which just has our, so the V-Indoc indices and indicators, but we also provide you with an extended version where we have harmonized a lot of additional variables on education and the media to help you or to facilitate easier analysis and research on these topics. And as I said, they are, as you already saw in the previous screen, this data set is available in all kinds of versions. But if you don't like our measurement model, or you would like to play around with the coder level data, we also make that data available. And that data is only available as a CSV file. But from that, you can obviously easily translate it into the other formats. So the extended data set that we made available so far has an additional 214 variables. We keep working on this, and we will probably update the data set at some point to add more variables. But we already have a lot of areas covered that come from different sources or the big international organizations, but also, like really important project data that other people have collected. So here, for example, you have, the Bromley et al. Data on textbooks, which is, the data we also used for our validation and so on. So we hope that, this is something that you find helpful in having everything kind of in one place in the right format already. Okay, so that is the introduction of the data, and I will stop here now and hand over to Wusek to give you a little demonstration of our Shiny app that Wusek and Christina have developed. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wusek Kim, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Project DevEd. I'll be giving a brief overview of the V-Indoc Shiny app, which allows users to easily explore and visualize the dataset. First, the Shiny app can be accessed via the Project DevEd website. Once at the website, you can click the V-Indoc dataset tab, which is under the data and methods section. From here, you can go to explore the data, which contains a link to launch the Shiny app. Please note that the app is currently disabled, but it will become live shortly after the conclusion of the seminar. Once you load the app will first load an information screen that provides a basic overview of the app and dataset. There are 5 main tabs that you can use to explore the data, and I'll be reviewing each tab to demonstrate their function here. The descriptors tab generates basic summary statistics and histograms of the V-Indoc variables. The current variable selected is indoctrination potential in education, and the output displays the summary statistics and distribution of this variable. You have the option of saving this plot on your computer and other plots on the app using the download button on each tab. Below the plot, you'll see basic information about the substantive content of the variable. In particular, for indices, this information will show the variables that make up the index. This index, for example, is constructed based on the political education effort and indoctrination coherence variables in education. For indicators, let's say the centralized curriculum indicator, the information will instead show the ordinal responses used by experts to code the question. If you want more detailed information about the variables, you can launch the codebook in a new window with this button here. Note that for indicators, the plots in this app by default show the measurement model point estimates, which typically range from around -4 to 4. The measurement model also translates these point estimates back to the original ordinal scale, which can sometimes offer clearer substantive interpretations. You have the option of plotting these rescaled values through this input here. In the case of the centralized curriculum indicator, we see that this rescales a variable to range between its ordinal response scale, which goes from 0 to 3. Note that this option will not make a difference for indices, as all indices are constructed to range from 0 to 1. In sum, users can use the descriptors tab to quickly familiarize themselves with the V-Indoc variables. Moving on to the variable graph, this tab allows you to compare levels and trends in one variable across multiple countries. For instance, this plot shows a centralized curriculum indicator for Bolivia, South Africa, and the United States. The original scale input and download button have the same functions as before, and you can also adjust the date range for the plot using the slider below. The box here below shows the variable description about the variable selected here. A new option in the variable graph tab is this confidence rating option, which allows you to draw the 68% highest posterior density or credible intervals around the point estimates. The width of these credible intervals reflects the measurement uncertainty regarding the accuracy of these point estimates, and is affected by factors such as coder disagreements, coder reliability, and coder confidence. For example, we can be fairly confident in our point estimates when many coders select the same response, and the credible interval will be relatively narrow in this case. On the other hand, we'd be less certain in our point estimates when they rely on just one coder response or a few coder responses that diverge drastically. In such cases, the credible interval will be wider to reflect our uncertainty. For instance, here, we see that Bolivia's credible interval is much wider than that of the other two countries. This is since Bolivia's estimates are based on one coder response for this indicator, whereas the estimates for South Africa and the US draw on 13 and 20 responses respectively. Moreover, the coders are also generally in agreement over the centralization of the curriculum in South Africa and the US, which leads to relatively narrow credible intervals. Also, simply looking at the point estimates would suggest that Bolivia has consistently had a more centralized curriculum than South Africa. But we're unable to make such a definitive conclusion once we account for the uncertainties surrounding the point estimates. Conversely, regardless of the measurement uncertainty, we can be quite certain that the US has always had a more decentralized curriculum than the other two countries. Users can also plot estimates grouped by region type. For example, we can compare the control of educational agents index, which is based on the strength of teacher autonomy in unions and the political hiring and firing of teachers, over, say, autocracies and democracies. And here we can see that autocracies generally possess greater control of educational agents than democracies. You're also able to make comparisons across regions, for example, between Latin America and the Caribbean, and Asia and the Pacific. In sum, users can use this tab to conduct cross-country or cross-group comparisons between the variables in the V-Indoc dataset. While the variable graph plots one variable for multiple countries, the country graph lets users examine multiple variables within one country. For example, this plot replicates figure 11 in the working paper, which plots the three main education indices for Russia. From this plot, we can see a sharp decline in indoctrination potential and patriotic content, along with a sharp rise in democratic content in the build-up and aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, the plot suggests that these trends have been slowly reversing under Putin's rule. Since scales can also vary across variables, the plot here uses min-max scaling to rescale variables so that the levels are comparable. You have the option of plotting all variables according to their original scales, but note that variable scales can differ. For example, the indoctrination potential and education index ranges from 0 to 1, as it is an index, while the original scale for, let's say, an indicator state-owned print media can range between 0 and 4. As such, cross-variable comparisons may make less sense when using the original scale option in this tab. Nonetheless, users can use this tab to examine within-country trends in more detail. The next tab, and as its name suggests, lets you plot a scatter plot of two variables. You can also select relevant variables from other sources in this tab, which are outlined in more detail in the codebook. For instance, here we can visualize the relationship between the indoctrination potential index and V-Dem's liberal democracy index. We can flip the axis using this button, and it generally appears as though more democratic countries have a lower potential for indoctrination, And we can see that the correlation between these two variables is minus 0.46. Nonetheless, it's clear that this relationship is far from being deterministic. Moreover, the correlation in the first half of the time period covered is minus 0.42, whereas it increases in magnitude to minus 0.54 in the second half of the time period, which suggests that the association between these two variables has become stronger over time. So the scatter plot can help users identify such interesting relationships, variations, or questions that may be fruitful to explore. Within this tab, you also have the option of adding a smooth trend line generated by LOS. For example, if you look at the relationship between liberal democracy and the patriotic content index, for example, and then we draw the smooth trend line, we see that there seems to be little systematic relationship between the two variables, except in the highly democratic countries where the relationship becomes quite negative. Lastly, the interactive map allows you to visualize cross-national variations in the V-Indoc variables. And this map currently plots the democratic indoctrination content in education index over the world. You can zoom in and also hover over countries to get their specific values. For example, the value of the US for this index is 0.88, while the value of this index for China is 0.27. It should be noted that the map averages values of the variable over the selected date range. So currently the map shows the average value of the index over 1945 to 2021. If you want to plot the values for a given year, simply move both sliders to that given year. For example, we can look at the values of the index in 1945. And we see that the indoctrination content tends to lean towards being more autocratic around the world. However, when we plot 2021 values, we see that much of the indoctrination content has become more democratic globally. So this map should allow users to easily visualize global trends around the world and over time. This concludes the Shiny app overview. If you have any questions about the app, please feel free to reach out to us through our email address here at any time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Zach, for that demonstration. We answered quite a few questions on the way, so thank everyone for chipping in and answering. There is, just as far as I see it, Kyle is already dealing with the question about confidence intervals. There's certainly a lot of material that V-Dem produced over the years to kind of demonstrate how their measurement model works and so on. I'm sure that's what he's typing. Okay, I'm just looking kind of through whether there's any question that I might just want to pick up on. I think that most of them were quite specific and hopefully have been answered. I would just kind of give everyone a bit of time if you want to still ask some questions now that the presentation is over. Please do feel free. Mosek has also just linked again the link to the data set to be downloaded. So feel free to just go in and you can access the data now and do whatever you want with it. We do hope also that you find the Shiny app useful for just exploring the data in an easy, accessible way. This is hopefully also a great tool for teaching. Sometimes I find that quite helpful. I've definitely used the V-Dem Data Explorer quite a lot for teaching to easily show students some data. Okay, if there's no more questions coming in, then I would say we just leave it at this, and we hope you find our data helpful, and it will help to facilitate a lot of rich research on education, the media, indoctrination, teachers, schools, patriotism, whatever you're working on. If you have questions, do reach out. We hope that we provided all the information you need to get started. We want to hear, if you have issues with the data, if you find any mistakes in any of our documents, whether this is the paper, codebook, or the data itself, do let us know. And we hope that in the years to come, we see a lot of interesting papers using our data. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And yeah, hope to see a lot of exciting research. Thank you very much.